Hello, and welcome to Met Speaks. Alice Neel and Spanish Harlem are El Barrio. My name is Anne Meisinger. I'm an assistant educator for public programs and creative practice at the Met, and it is my tremendous honor to be introducing this program, which is being held in conjunction with the exhibition Alice Neel, People Come First. As our ongoing lecture and conversation program, Met Speaks always brings together a rich spectrum of voices and speakers on our special exhibitions and permanent collection. This exhibition, an ambitious survey, is the first museum retrospective in New York of Neel's work in over 20 years. It positions her as one of the century's most radical painters, a champion of social justice whose long-standing commitment to humanist principles inspired her life as well as her art. And now to introduce today's guests. Miguel Luciano is a multimedia visual artist whose work explores themes of history, popular culture, social justice, and migration through sculpture, painting, and socially engaged public art projects. His work has been exhibited at institutions across the world and is in the permanent collection at the Smithsonian American Art Museum and the Brooklyn Museum, among other institutions. At the Met, he is a civic practice partnership artist. The Met Civic Practice Partnership, launched in 2017, catalyzes and implements creative projects that advance healthy communities by bringing the skills and interests of neighborhood stakeholders together with those of the Met and artists who are socially minded in their practice. Susanna Temkin joined El Museo del Barrio as a curator in 2018, and there she most recently organized Estamos Bien, La Trienal 2020-21, the museum's first national large-scale survey of Latinx contemporary artists, featuring more than 40 artists from across the United States and Puerto Rico. Prior to her appointment at El Museo, she served as the assistant curator at the Americas Society in New York. She is the author of the essay Siempre en la Calle, which can be found in the catalog for the exhibition Alice Neel, People Come First. Randy Griffey is a curator at the Met in the Department of Modern and Contemporary Art, where he has been since 2013. He has organized many exhibitions at the museum, including Marsden Hartley's Maine, and is the co-organizer of Alice Neel, People Come First, with Kelly Baum, Cynthia Hazen-Polsky, and Leon Polsky, curator of contemporary art in the Department of Modern and Contemporary Art, also at the Met. Thank you, Randy, Miguel, and Susanna for joining us.
Thanks very much, Anne. It's a real treat for me to be here with Susanna and Miguel to focus on this subject around the Alice Neel exhibition, Alice Neel, People Come First. In recent years, Neel's time working and living in Spanish Harlem from 1938 to 1962 has emerged as this important period in her career, one that was revealed in an important exhibition curated by Hilton Alls about 3 years ago called Uptown. And we wanted to focus today on Neel's art from this period that appears in the exhibition, but also take the opportunity to delve into the history of this culturally rich and historically rich part of New York City, one that Neel felt very connected to. In fact, Neel said at one point that East Harlem was a battleground of humanism, and she was on the side of the people there. So that quote, very potent quote, is a good jumping off point, I think, for our discussion today. You're looking here now at a picture of Neel from 1944 in her Spanish Harlem apartment. You can see her surrounded by her art, and that helps to make a very critical point that is made through the exhibition, that Neel was always painting at home in her apartment. She never had the luxury of a separate studio, so her home was her studio was her home. And you see that very powerfully here as she's sitting on the floor surrounded by her work. Just by way of getting oriented, taking the big picture here of the island of Manhattan, and then we will highlight, for those tuning in, the area that we are focusing on, which is East Harlem, known as Spanish Harlem or El Barrio, which you see in greater detail on the right-hand side here. Also, there is a site called out on the detail on the right that is near and dear to Susanna's heart. Yes. What is that, Susanna? What do
I
you see here?
I hope that we see a Museo del Barrio, where I'm very happily employed as the curator there, and that Miguel also has a long-standing relationship with.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Uh,
it's one of the cultural centers of the neighborhood and beyond for that matter.
absolutely.
And also post dates Neil's time living and working there, right? So uh, this great institution came after Neil left the region, left the neighborhood. So this is the earliest depiction of Spanish Harlem we know by Neil. This street view, Spanish Harlem from 1938. It's a work that announces in the exhibition installation her move from Greenwich Village and the meatpacking district, where she lived in the 30s, to Spanish Harlem in 1938. Her move was precipitated by her pregnancy with what would be her first son, Richard, with her then partner, Jose Negron. And they moved up to Spanish Harlem in preparation for that birth and to be closer to Jose's family in the event that they would need help taking care of their newborn. So interestingly, Neil's street scene here actually resonates very much and depicts very much a kind of street scene that you might have, or image of the facades of the buildings along this neighborhood that you might have even walking down the street today. Her first residence was essentially at Fifth Avenue and 107th. Soon thereafter, she moved up a block, but this is this view of the image on the right of the street of 107th. You can see Neil capturing the character of these buildings in a way that seems almost like a likeness. So I'm curious for Susanna and Miguel, what this relationship, what the dialogue between the painting and this photograph suggests to you. What thoughts come to mind?
I mean, for me, it's fascinating because we're looking at a building that still exists, right? So this is 107th Street, right? Is this 100? This was the 107th
This
Street
one was
apartment.
open.
So this is like a nice part of East Harlem. It always has been very close to the park. You know, the apartments are in bigger buildings, etc. I live in East Harlem. Further east, I'm on 99th between Second and Third, and so I live in a building that's one of the oldest buildings in East Harlem. It was an old schoolhouse built in 1898 that was a school for about almost 100 years before being abandoned and eventually being turned into affordable housing for artists. So it's PS 109 at Barrio's Art Space. It's a really amazing place to live. But it's also a rare kind of space in New York. I'm so grateful that it's in East Harlem because they're artists' live workspaces. So looking at the previous images of Alice Neel's studio apartment, it reminds me in some ways of the energy of this building that's filled with artists of different disciplines. But it's taken that long for a building like this to happen in East Harlem. You know, so the closer that you are to the park, the nicer the buildings are. And so but what strikes me about this painting is that unlike some of the other paintings that we'll see of El Barrio and of East Harlem, there are few people in the streets. This was kind of about the architecture in some ways of the building and the space on that block. But even this part of East Harlem comes to life with the people of the neighborhood, right? So that's one of the things that's not quite in this work yet, right? But that really comes forward in her other paintings.
yeah, I mean, I really appreciate, Miguel, that you're pointing out that this is a nice building. She lived in a railroad apartment, but we're just a couple doors down from Central Park. And that's something that I was really thinking about when I was writing the essay, because I feel that so oftentimes in the literature, um, Neil's move to East Harlem is really portrayed in a very alienating way. I mean, I think there have been some scholars who have even used the words alienating with all of its resonances when it comes to immigration, which I know we're going to talk about in just a minute. But I don't think that, whether rightly or wrongly, we can talk about Neil's relationship with the neighborhood later. But I don't think she found it so apart or so different or so I don't know, negative in certain cases. And in a work like this, you're right, Miguel, that there aren't so many people in this particular image, but they are there if you look close enough. There's that couple that I see entering the building. I think part of the reason Alice Neel was, in a way, happy to come to East Harlem was that it was a refuge for her when she was about to give birth to her first son, her third child. And then we also see the peddler walking down the street. So, there's activity happening. And then there's even, I believe there's a woman working in the window. So I think it's much more subtle and a lot less focused than the portraits that I know we'll talk about later. But for me, especially with this work, I think there's probably an allegory that's taking place that's relating to Neil's own particular moment in her life at that moment.
Yeah, you're right, Suzanne. Of course, that this move uptown has been written about in a very disparaging way, and in certain instances, in the sense that Neil, it's like she committed a cardinal sin by moving out of the village, and um, but in fact, what she has said on her way out of the village uptown was, I mean, she indicated that she was very happy to get out of the village in many instances. So there's been a great disconnect, I think, between the way Neil felt in Spanish Harlem and how a lot of writers, yourself and Hilton Alls, as exceptions, have written about that period in her career. So I love this kind of data. Love doing this kind of research. And again, it's not rocket science, but ancestry.com is a great resource, and I try to dig out as many biographical details relating to, in this case, Alice Neel's life as possible. And so this is a U.S. Census page, which includes Neel and her son, although he's misidentified as a daughter. In the census page, you see her highlighted at the very top. But what is, I think, also so illuminating about this is that in the column that designates country of origin or place of origin, you get a sense of how many members or how many of her neighbors hailed from Puerto Rico. And I don't have exact percentages here, but if you look at this column of information, nearly half, if not more than half, of the residents identified Puerto Rico as place of origin. So what does this tell us about Neel's new habitat, her new home in this place?
I mean, she moves to Spanish Harlem, right in the middle of our great migration to the States from Puerto Rico, and so this is the time that a lot of my family comes to the U.S. Most of them came through New York, those from Puerto Rico, and so between the 1940s and the 1960s, 1 million Puerto Ricans migrated to the U.S., and most came to the Northeast first, through places like New York City. So that's a significant number, considering that the island population is about 3.5 million. So over a quarter of the population migrates during that time, and it was part of a government-sponsored initiative that was really Operation Bootstrap was a program to provide cheaper labor for factories and farms, and Puerto Ricans were recruited basically also for this work. And that's what a lot of folks did here, was worked in factories, did piecework, all kinds of stuff like this here in the city. But that's when Spanish Harlem grows to be known as it is today, as this symbolic center of the Puerto Rican community in New York.
Susanna, would you like to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I want to add too. You said you called it Spanish Harlem, Miguel, and I think you and I will probably be, talking about the neighborhood in different ways as Spanish Harlem, as East Harlem, as El Barrio, which is, roughly the neighborhood, hood. Just to point out that, as you're saying, I mean, Neil is really arriving right as this neighborhood is really taking shape into what it is today still. Um, and I think that's really significant that she's a part of that and witness to that.
Well, and then she records it, right? So that's for me what becomes so special about her paintings, looking at the years in which they were created, is that they actually document our community in a really special way at a time when there are very few paintings that actually visually represent our people in that history, right? And in New York City's history, for that matter. At least in terms of images that get represented in major museums, because within our own community, there were many artists also that were sort of burgeoning at that time. The 1950s is sort of also like the kind of high point of our migration, and it's really when you have the birth of a Nuyorican generation in significant numbers. So people who are being born here in New York City, whose parents were from the island, and the experience of the diaspora of being Nuyorican is really growing from the 1950s on in a major way. And the Nuyorican arts movement that emerges from that history is incredible. So one of the things that's exciting to me about this exhibition and the Spanish Harlem series is that there are more Puerto Ricans on the wall at the Met right now than I've ever seen in my lifetime, right? Just in these paintings alone. And, when I was doing research in the Civic Practice Partnership residency, the first thing I was doing is looking for, where are we in the institution, right? And it didn't take long, sort of researching the collection to realize that we don't have a lot of representation, even in the collection, and most of what is there has never been exhibited. So moments like this, where we can actually see ourselves on the wall, really, really matter, right? And I think these kinds of moments become even more powerful when we start to see them produced by artists from our own communities. And so, looking forward, I think that's where I hope this conversation expands to, and where programming can expand to, where we start to see a much broader, more diverse representation of the people of our communities made by artists from our own neighborhoods.
So it bears noting that she moved up to Spanish Harlem with, as I mentioned, Jose Negron, who was himself Puerto Rican, a musician, rendered here by Neel in this very romantic portrait from 1936. So Neel becomes pregnant with their son, which is Richard, Neel's first of two sons and third of four children that she would give birth to. So it's Jose, his family, and their neighborhood that becomes Neel's new world. All right, so Jose appears here now holding a guitar, of course, which signals his the fact that he is a musician. On the right is an image of him and his band, but he is leaning over a piece of music, Miguel, right? That is very interesting.
So it's interesting because the image on the right of the band is a different kind of performative music, right? That was being played, perhaps at nightclubs and things, because they met in a club, right? She falls in love with a Puerto Rican musician, and I think this is a really important part of the story that gets overlooked, is that she moves to El Barrio with Jose Negron, right, with her partner. And so it wasn't moving there, on her own. She wasn't sort of a white woman living in East Harlem, independently in the beginning, right? But it becomes that shortly thereafter. And the portrait on the left, for me, is such a it's such an interesting photo of both Negron as a musician, but also of the kind of music that he was thinking about, I assume, and that she was connecting with. So the lyrics "Puerto Rico Libre" on the sort of note sheet in front of him as a musician, he looks like a folk musician in this painting, and maybe it was a more relaxed portrait at home. But that was, and is the cry for independence in Puerto Rico today, and especially was back then in the 30s. There was a big movement for Puerto Rico's independence that was led by Pedro Albizu Campos, who was the leader of the Nationalist Party at that time, and that movement was terribly repressed, and Albizu was jailed. There was incredible government repression, and so this is a very political sort of lyric that he's singing in this song that was, really an anthem for the island. And it also says something that, about, I think, the politics that Alice Neel is connecting to, even through our community, which is amazing, because this is a very left of center movement for decolonization, for the liberation of Puerto Rico.
And before we leave Puerto Rico Libre here, just curious if you think that there's any significance, particularly about the date of 1939. Does that resonate in any way that casts this image in a particular light, or?
I mean, in 1939, first of all, Puerto Rico is still a colony today. It's by another name. We are a neo-colonial state, basically. But in the 1930s, we were unquestionably a colony of the United States. So it's not until the 1950s that political status changes through our Constitution, where the Commonwealth is created in 1952, and our Constitution is drafted, and we get to elect our own leaders. But at this time, in the 30s, it's the United States that's appointing all of the leadership that governs the island. They were usually military leaders that were appointed into those roles early on. From 1898, through the 40s, that was the case. And again, this was during sort of the height of resistance among the nationalists in Puerto Rico and the Nationalist Party. So, and the persecution of Albizu Campos. So it is a charged year among communities that were fighting for independence on the island, and that was still a back and forth struggle. By 1948, they instituted the Gag Laws, and so the Gag Laws, La Ley de la Mordaza, it prohibited flying the Puerto Rican flag, and it was punishable by jail of up to 10 years. So the colors that his clothing here, that Negron's clothing is painted with, reflect the colors of the Puerto Rican flag, the original Puerto Rican flag, which was the sky blue with the red and white stripes. And it's kind of an inverse or reflection of the Cuban flag. And it was actually made as a kind of mirror of the Cuban flag by Puerto Rican members of the Cuban Revolutionary Party in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And so that was here in New York, actually, that took place. So there's a lot of politics embedded in these very subtle sort of suggestions here. That's part of why I love this painting. I hadn't seen it before. And it gives us sort of like a window into not just who was here, but what kinds of things that our community was working on, right? And these are not typically the issues that get highlighted or foregrounded in any art from this period. So this is a really exciting element of Neel's work that we get to sort of peer into.
Yeah. So this was a discovery for me, I have to admit. And Susanna knows that her essay, the research she did around Fish Market from 1947, is exactly what prompted co-curator Kelly and me to add this work into the exhibition. Previously, it had not been on the checklist, but Susanna's great research here made us revisit that decision. So, Susanna, can you tell us what we're looking at here and why it's important?
Yeah, well, so this painting, it's known, I think, kind of obliquely, very simply, as Fish Market. But I think for anyone who's familiar with El Barrio, I know Miguel sees it immediately. But those windows that you see in this scene, this is clearly La Marqueta. So La Marqueta was it's actually part of Mayor LaGuardia had created a campaign to create these major food halls, basically, precisely to replace people like that peddler that we saw in that Spanish Harlem street scene to try and, make food and improve the health and sanitation of the city by congregating all of the fishmongers and the vegetable stalls in one place. So La Marqueta was one of them, created on 116th and Park Avenue. It's still there underneath the railroad tracks. But this was really part of a system of food halls all across the boroughs. If you're familiar with New York, Essex Street Market, which the original just got replaced with a new one. This is all part of the same system. And it still exists in East Harlem. So I was so excited when I saw this. I started wondering, is it really La Marqueta? And of course it is.
Yeah, this was part of my education, to be fully frank. Part of my education around this project, and of course, partly we do what we do to keep learning, and this is something I learned, which was very rewarding, thanks to Susanna's work. And so Miguel here also. So here we're looking at an interior and an exterior photograph of the market.
Right. And this,
What does this tell you?
well, this is, I mean, I love this painting because it's a very familiar space for many of us in El Barrio. It still exists. That structure is right underneath the Metro North trains. And so, as Susanna said, it was created basically to replace street vending carts in the city and bring street vendors, vegetable vendors, and food vendors indoors for an indoor market. And so the food hall, it also, they kind of operate like food halls and marketplaces today. But it was, I think, initially sort of like a project to improve sanitation, for the street vending carts and things like that. What it came to be known as by the 1950s was the place you could buy Puerto Rican food products, right? And if you were Latinx or Caribbean in the city, like this was a place where you could go to get your ingredients. And so many people have stories about their memories from the 50s, 60s, 70s, coming to La Marqueta from all over the city because it was where you could get all kinds of imports from the Caribbean that were hard to find in the city. It started on 111th and went all the way up to 116th. And like on 111th Street, right next to La Marqueta at that time, you had like, I think it was called like the Puerto Rico Banana Company or something like that. There was a banana import company that folks that I talked to worked at, carrying bunches of bananas, plantains, all kinds of things that would come in, sugarcane, coconut, you name it. So it's still that kind of place today, albeit much smaller. It's gone through a whole renovation that is not quite finished and got delayed by COVID, but it will be centered on 116th Street and Park right underneath the Metro North. And they have like a newly enclosed kind of section now that became an addition. So it'll be exciting to see what comes from that. But part of that, I think, was built as a way of reviving this history. And in recent years, it became a place for cultural activities, also performances, gatherings, incredibly celebratory because we celebrate all of our histories that are connected to that space and the culture of the community that still survives and is vibrant in our community today. So it's full of life. I mean, that place is full of life and memory.
What I found interesting is the fact that, I mean, Neel is in La Marqueta. Like, I imagine that's maybe where she's shopping. She's really a part of the neighborhood and, that's where she gets her provisions. And yet at the same time, I've always been thinking about the construction of this image. And it kind of relates back to that first Spanish Harlem street scene that we've seen too, trying to like place myself in her shoes in this image because in this image, I mean, it's accurate to La Marqueta's architecture from what I've seen in some of these vintage art, vintage photographs. There are these sort of like stairways that I think you may have navigated at one point. But at the same time, this is kind of like she's looking down at the people. She's not with the people, even though it seems like she might be on her way to being with them. Maybe she's going to descend the stairs and go buy her fish too. But that's always struck me that she's a little bit apart. And the other aspect of this kind of architectural reading that I've been thinking about with this image is that it's really structured along gender lines. You know, it's women and children on the left buying the fish, and it's mostly or all men who are manning the fish stall. Um, and of course, Neil would be with the women. You know, she was a
Mhm.
mother. Again, I really try and put myself in her shoes when I'm thinking about her walking the streets of East Harlem with her kids in tow, and you know, how would that open up doors or close doors, or how would that have impacted who she was meeting in the neighborhood?
So,
Yeah.
Miguel, who do we have here?
So this is a photograph by Hiram Maristani from the '60s, and so this tells you right away like how La Marqueta was full of Puerto Rican food products, Caribbean food products, and very vibrant and alive. And I think even in Neil's painting, part of what she was probably interested in capturing there was dramatic light. And even if it doesn't appear as dramatic in the painting itself, those large windows that allow the light to come in and shine over the produce and shine over, all of the merchants' sort of stalls makes it a pretty visually spectacular place. Even today, you can still understand. If you go in there, you can see how that works and feels. Would have been much more dynamic at this time. And so, Hiram Maristani is a East Harlem photographer, born and raised, and their histories kind of overlap because he would have been born around the time that Neil starts painting in East Harlem, kind of when she moves to East Harlem, basically. And he becomes the most important photographer in East Harlem's history, really. And he's still very much with us, a dear friend and neighbor. And I know from his own stories that in the early '60s, perhaps late '50s, one of his first jobs was selling shopping bags to the vendors at La Marqueta, and he'd buy them in bulk from somewhere in the city, and then he'd sell them individually to the shoppers in La Marqueta. And he's got great stories, but he grew up sort of like it was literally on his block on 111th Street. So he later would document all of this history in his photography.
I love this comparison, partly because it does throw into high relief that point we were making earlier about vantage point and looking down on the scene with Neil. But here in Hiram's photograph, you feel like you're right in the thick of the action. And I do love the scales appearing in both the painting and also so prominently, of course, in the photograph.
Yeah.
Susanna, would you like to say something about this
Yeah, I mean, I love
image?
that you brought up the scale too, because I mean, like I said, when I first saw this image and I was looking at the date, I believed it had to be La Marqueta. Um, but looking at the photographs of the time, um, it was amazing to me to see like those really were the scales, and also the lights that are hanging down. You know, it's sort of this cavernous space. Again, we were saying that it's underneath the Metro North railways. So if you're familiar with the area, you know it's this sort of like big arching space. And so you can see how the lights come all the way down to the ceiling. And so, yeah, the tiles in the back are also, completely accurate of what La Marqueta looks like today to some extent as well.
So this is one of Neil's most haunting and poignant, powerful and memorable paintings from her Spanish Harlem period called TB Harlem from 1940. It's actually probably one of Neil's best known early works, which has been reproduced uh, considerably. And it opens up a whole new range of issues around Neil's representation of, in this case, her extended family, in the sense that this is Jose's brother. And obviously, he's enduring here, convalescing from a terrible physical experience or ailment. And I just would love to talk with you both, Susanna and Miguel, about what's happening here and what are the larger implications of what we're looking at.
Yeah, I think this again, it speaks back to the fact that when Alice Neel came to El Barrio, she didn't come alone, and in a way, she was coming into the neighborhood because of family. So this is Carlos, Jose's brother. And as you just mentioned, he suffered from tuberculosis, which is a disease that disproportionately affects impoverished neighborhoods, and has had its imprint on East Harlem, as early as this, probably long before even Alice Neel arrived. And Carlos is one of the people who has suffered from it. I think also, I don't want to get us too far apart from the issues of tuberculosis that I'll leave to Miguel, but I also think it's interesting the titles that have come with these paintings and that we've inherited over the years, and the fact that there's really no recognition that this is her brother-in-law. It's sort of this martyr like scene, tied to a particular disease rather than the person himself, who we know, like, she clearly did have a relationship, even to be so close to someone convalescing in their bed imparts a certain intimacy. And I think that's part and parcel of the fact that a lot of these images weren't shown right away. So I know that we've had some conversations, Randy, and with Kelly as well, about how these paintings were given their names, in some cases years after they were painted, for very different contexts. But it is curious that we do know that this is her brother-in-law, but that's not kind of immortalized through the title itself, and you really have to learn the history in order to know that to be true.
Miguel, would you like to pick up there?
Sure, sure. Thank you for that point, Susanna. I think that's something that was revelatory to me as well, in learning more about this painting, and actually learning more about many of the other paintings that also featured extended family. It's something that I think the general public is not very aware of as well. But it also kind of it's a heartbreaking painting of her brother-in-law. And maybe, I don't know, maybe she titled them generically to keep some level of privacy her own. Is I would imagine, anyways. But she had a child with Jose, who's Puerto Rican, also, here in the neighborhood, and so she was very intimately connected to friends and family in the neighborhood of her own. So it's, as you said, this was an epidemic in East Harlem, even as far back as the 40s. That was, a preventable epidemic. It's a disease that festered due to poor sanitation and neglect, that was, disproportionately abundant in impoverished communities.
I believe that the treatment he's endured has to do with deflating the infected lung, which involved removing ribs. So it's incredibly invasive, and of course, a difficult recovery. So but again, the point here again is interesting, that this title essentializes Carlos with regard to his condition, his illness, and the place. It does also then serve another function to, in a way, protect his privacy to some extent. And he is an extended family member. So this is an instance where we've talked about Neel's separation in certain ways through her imagery from El Barrio, but in this instance, it really highlights how very close. I mean, this is a family difficulty for Carlos, of course, but his family members as well. So we have a larger context for this idea, this subject of tuberculosis.
So this is 30 years later, that this photograph by Hiram Maristani again is addressing the same issues in East Harlem. This is an image from the Young Lords history, from the activist history of the Young Lords in El Barrio. And the Young Lords, if you don't know who the Young Lords were a radical group of Puerto Rican activists who fought for social justice in East Harlem. They fought against oppression for all peoples, and they were fighting for the liberation of Puerto Rico. But they focused locally on four platform issues that dealt with health, food, education, and housing. And so, even by 1970, tuberculosis rates in East Harlem were still the highest in the entire city. But the basic services to treat tuberculosis, to test for it, were still hard to access. So the young lords reached out to the health department, and they tried to get the health department to tell them where the truck's location would be. There was this mobile unit for chest x-rays, which is how they tested for tuberculosis. And the health department would not give them any information. They got nowhere with it. So at some point, they found out that the truck was stationed in a different part of Harlem, and they organized an action to take the truck and bring it back to El Barrio, where people needed the testing the most. And so this was the liberation of the TB testing truck, or the takeover of the TB testing truck. And they brought it several blocks from another kind of area that had a very low foot traffic for these services, and they pushed the truck all the way to the headquarters, which was on Madison and 111th Street, 112th. They pushed the truck because no, it was a stick shift, and nobody knew how to drive the stick. But which is part of what makes this photo so amazing. And the community joined in. These are not all Young Lords members, but also community members that helped in this initiative. What's brilliant about this story is that they convinced the technicians to come with them. They said, they dressed in lab coats, the Young Lords themselves, and made themselves look like medical professionals and very official, and staged this whole thing. But they convinced the technicians that all they wanted to do was test people on their block. They set the truck up for local testings. The technicians came along, and within the first 3 days, they tested something like 770 people. And that was compared to maybe 300 people that would have been tested in the same amount of time in the previous location. So they almost triple the number of people being tested. And they demonstrate a couple of things. One is that there was still a huge need for testing of tuberculosis in East Harlem. And people tested positive and they got treatment, during those days. But they also demonstrated one of their principles, which is that they believed in community control over public resources, and that the community could do it better if they were able to control these kinds of resources and have access to them. So they modeled the practice, and eventually it led to the city putting mobile units more regularly in East Harlem for testing.
Yeah, and looking at these two images together too, I mean, it highlights the degree to which Neel paints Carlos, of course, as a kind of martyr to his illness. And then by contrast, Hiram's photograph indicates a kind of political activism that rallied around this illness, maybe a little bit later in the decade. And this beautiful painting called The Spanish Family from 1943 shows Margarita, who is Carlos's wife, with their three children at this moment, in this terribly poignant, nearly monochromatic depiction of this family unit, which of course again is part of Neel's extended family, really. And you make this point, Susanna, in your essay. Would you like to elaborate on that?
I mean, perhaps I'm getting a little too romantic myself, but again, this is her family, and I know that some people have read a distance between Neel and Margarita and her children. But when I look at this picture, something that really stands out to me are the ironwork grill that they're sitting in front of. Going back to the vernacular architecture that we saw again in that first Spanish Harlem cityscape. And here, they're hearts. They're like these curly Q hearts. So for me, it really reads, it's a poignant family scene, but maybe there is these embedded symbols of family among them. I also see, Margarita looks exhausted. We know that her husband is, ill with tuberculosis. I think it's interesting to think of these two images as pendants or like a diptych. And so I think Neel, again, there's a certain intimacy to always letting yourself be the subject of a portrait, but at a time of hardship, when you have three children that you're taking care of, when you're exhausted. And I feel like that's also what Neel is capturing. It's like what's really going on in their nuclear family. Maybe Neel sees something of the same in herself, raising these kids alone, because I think by this time, I mean, Jose didn't stay despite their love affair. Jose didn't really stick around for Neil for very long, and I think actually this image, it's made long after he's gone, so we know that there's still some kind of relationship happening between Neil and her, I guess, kind of extended but ex family to a certain extent.
I mean, this is one of my favorites. I have to admit, from the images of children in Spanish Harlem in the show. But again, we really don't know her by name. And the title she's inherited is Puerto Rican Girl in a Chair, or on a Chair, 1949. I mean, it raises this issue of the anonymity of Neil's sitters, the fact that they aren't identified by name. What does that mean? What are the implications of that anonymity? That seems to be especially true with her images of children. So perhaps there is intent on the artist's part to maybe more protect the identities of the children she paints, but that wasn't always the case because, of course, Georgie Arce appears multiple times with his name, either as a title or subtitle. So what do either of you have to say in response to this beautiful painting of this girl?
I mean, for me, it's like many of the other paintings where I find them to be really beautiful portraits of our community, and that were painted in a very intimate setting. And I've always been grateful to see these paintings because they are these kind of rare reflections of Puerto Ricans in East Harlem in the 40s. And at the same time, the kind of generic titles, um, I've always questioned, because they do create a kind of distance, right? And impersonal kind of relationship, perhaps for us as viewers. And that's one of the things that I've questioned is in the viewing experience for others, right? Is how the titles have perhaps allowed people to further objectify and distance themselves from the subjects in her paintings at times, which I think is an unfortunate sort of result of how that works. I'm so intrigued by all these kind of interpersonal stories of how she was connected to the sitters. And I wish, and I love that about this exhibition, by the way, that it teases out some of those relationships, and that those are in the essays of the catalog, because I think it's important for us to understand in Neil's relationship to the people that she's painting, that everything about who she is, her interest in humanism, makes us want to understand the names and faces, right, intimately, and how we're all connected. And the titles often block us from doing that.
Right, she's identified in a way as a type more than an individual, of course, which is
Right.
part of the. I mean, that's part of the problematic scenario that we've been alluding to. Susanna, you want to
Yeah, I
add to
was going
that?
to say, again, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the fact that sometimes these titles are tacked on years later, or sometimes these works have multiple titles. But it's also curious to me. I mean, this is the Puerto Rican girl versus the image we just saw of Margarita and the children. That was the Spanish family, even though we know that they were Puerto Rican. In other instances, we hear about the Dominican boys. I mean, maybe the Dominican boys were Puerto. There's a sort of like looseness
Mm-hmm.
to how people are described. Which is something that we talk about a lot at El Museo. Terms and identity are really important. How you self-identify, but even more so how other people identify you. So, that's a question, and I like Miguel. I think it's interesting to, was she protecting these children? Did she really know their names? I know in some cases, I think we have an image of Carmen, her neighbor's children, Carmen and
Judy.
Encarnacion,
Yeah.
coming up, that we know who their names are, even though that's not inscribed in the title. I mean, same with her family, and I don't know what the answer is, and maybe Neil didn't even have an answer either. Maybe she really wasn't thinking about titles until the time came to put him up. I'm not sure.
But I think that's why it's important to talk about these things now, though, because this may have been common sort of practice, but it also just kind of feeds into the objectification of the people that she's representing, right? And so it does the opposite of what I think it's the intention of the work is sometimes. Um, and this is something that has happened with a lot of photographers and others that have seen our communities from the outside, that the kind of generic objectifying kind of titles contribute to a kind of otherness or othering, right? That I think is actually the opposite of the energy that Neel's interested in. So it is a kind of a conflict with the kind of energy of the paintings themselves, I think.
Yeah, they start working a bit at cross purposes, maybe. Um, the generic titles that are seem to be also inconsistent from one work to the next with regard to identification of national identity, place, and what we think of as Neel's intent to suggest a connection to a sitter that she um, has in her environs, in her neighborhood. Let's.
And, it, and
Oh, go ahead. Go.
I just as a last point, I think we also have to ask the question about who the audiences for these paintings are, also, and who those titles are sort of being read by, because that's another part of this equation: is that the audience for this work was not necessarily the community that was being represented, right?
Mm.
And so, again, going back to the way that others from the outside see our community representations, the generic titles again feed into a kind of objectification of these other communities. And I think that's part of the problematic of how this work was perhaps exhibited. And, the audiences that were engaging, with the work during these years or the subsequent years. But it's still, I think these are all really important issues to think about today, as we work to sort of to correct some of those approaches, right? And I say this really with a lot of love for Neel's paintings, obviously, and I just think it's one of those things that it has not been problematized enough within institutional spaces.
So there is a section in the exhibition that visitors will see if they haven't yet already come through, that puts works of art in the Met's collection in dialogue with selections of Neel's paintings. And this is one of those a really wonderful, I think, dynamic pairings of a photograph of Helen Levitt here that you see on the right, put into dialogue with Neel's Dominican Boys on 108th Street from 1955. So Susanna, I'd really love to hear what you might have to say about the kind of conversation you feel like is happening here between Levitt and Neel's work.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, well, in my essay, I try and place Neel in a context of other artists working in the neighborhood. And interestingly enough, I was mostly looking at photographers. And one of the photographers that was essentially working at the same time as Neel, although I have a feeling they must have known each other, but I don't really know the extent of the relationship, but both of them, had stints with the WPA. They were obviously in the neighborhood, although in a slightly different positions. So of course Neel is living there, working there, sort of round the clock. And Helen Levitt is certainly in the neighborhood. I think she's a teacher at one of the schools, but going home at night. And I feel like, obviously teachers also carry with them a different level of authority. And I feel like that, to an extent, we see in their different practices, both of which capture, the children on the street. And Helen is really interested in portraying kids at play. But I love this too because they're sort of like, the kids are kind of like fronting, they're kind of like showing their stuff on the streets. But I feel like there's a gentleness with the inscribed into the painting. The kids, I feel like they're looking tough, but they're relaxed around Neel. In the case of Helen Levitt, half the kids aren't even looking at her, which also relates to her practice because she was using a method of photography where she was trying to hide the camera. But certainly, this one little boy looks like he sees her, and he doesn't really seem to be welcoming her, so to speak. Um, he almost seems to be telling her to get out. But I love looking at these two images, even the amount of detail that we can see in the background. Helen Levitt has given such, like, almost creating this abstract expanse behind the boys. But with Alice Neel, once again, like, we really see the details of the neighborhood. We see the other kids playing on the stoop. Um, behind the one boy, there's the going back to the ideas of naming. It looks like graffiti over the head of the boy wearing green that says Felipe. You know, is that in a way Neil's homage to, like, capturing who this is? Is that just graffiti on the street? I find this particular work so endearing, and that there's a lot to really unpack when you start to get into some of those details.
The comparison with Levitt really highlights for me the degree to which Neil really monumentalizes these boys. They almost look like little men, and they fill up
Totally.
so much of the composition, right? And by contrast, Levitt's figures are smaller, and there's a greater sense of spontaneity. They're less monumental, less iconic in a certain sense. But of course, that's befitting, I guess, the perhaps the of Levitt's practice of photography and the sense of spontaneity that she maybe wanted. So, Miguel, again, you speak so powerfully about Hiram's work and his sort of place in this trajectory, and especially thinking of the Neel painting Dominican Boys we just saw. This this photograph by Hiram seems, like it's just like a natural next step in a certain way to what we've been looking at.
Sure, and I love that this is included in your essay in the catalog, Susana. It's the Dominican boys painting also reminds us that Dominicans were also in El Barrio as far back as the 50s also. So I love that that painting is a reminder, right, of a more complex Caribbean Latino neighborhood. In Hiram's photos, so this is mid 60s. This is the generation that is coming of age, from the time that Alice Neel sort of like arrives in East Harlem. This generation is being born, really, and by the time she leaves, someone like Hiram Aristani is coming of age as a young photographer, and his early photography in the early '60s really captured the beauty and the dignity and of everyday people in El Barrio. And I love that about his imagery. Children at play, folks at the, working in the stalls at La Marqueta, family members and friends. But he knew everybody he was photographing. And so he could tell you the names of all the kids in this photo, probably, even today. And there are these intimate sort of portraits, again, of our community's history and the people that were here at that time. So I love these images so much because it reminds us of the history of the neighborhood that we live in today. But his work is only now getting, I think, the attention that it deserves after many, many years. This is over 50 years ago. And only in recent years has this work started to be acquired by major museums. And the Smithsonian American Art Museum, I think, has this in their collection now, but it's only recently started to happen, so many years later.
Susanna, as Miguel said, you included this in your terrific essay. Would you like to weigh in, and in what context did you come to this image as a part of your essay?
Yeah, I mean, just to echo what Miguel was saying, I kind of see these young men, which is also interesting in the title, as opposed to boys. I mean, they do look slightly older than the two children that we saw in the Neel portrait, but I think there's a difference in how Hiram is very conscious about how he's calling them. I know, but I like to think of them as, the next generation. Even imagining some kind of familial relationships or cousin relationships between the two kids all grown up and this next wave of artists. And I do, again, I feel like Alice Neel just missed this very critical moment in East Harlem by moving to the West Side, where her portraits, the people that she's making pictures of, I should say, um, changed dramatically, even though the neighborhood that she moved to also had a really large Latino population at the time. But she didn't continue to depict them once she moved to the West Side. So it's interesting to me to think about, what changed. I mean, certainly, she's gotten older, she's received a little bit more fame. But on that note, her and Hiram, I think they really did intersect. I pretty much know they intersected because they were both on the picket lines at the Met and at the Whitney, arguing for the inclusion of, artists of color in New York City institutions. And I think we can
Mhm.
point out that, Neel deserves her due at the Met, but there's a lot of other artists from this neighborhood who still, the work is there. So I think they merit some attention, and hopefully we can also see, shows by Hiram and all of the other East Harlem artists, at all the institutions sooner rather than later. So.
Yeah, that. Thank you for that, and that is maybe a good note to wrap up this terrific conversation. Thank you both so much for your time and expertise and insight into this body of Neel's work, but the history, politics, and character of Spanish Harlem, which we know now played such a role in Neel's art and her life. And we're very fortunate to have you both participate to help us better understand the the richness, but also the complexities of Neel's art from this time and this place. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Great.